A black woman's compassion forever changed the lives of 3 homeless children, only for fate to deliver a cruel twist that threatened to separate them forever. Her selfless act of taking in these vulnerable kids would be tested 25 years later when she faced a life sentence that seemed inescapable until they intervened in a way no one saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The gavel struck like a thunderclap in the Sao Paulo courthouse, reverberating through Maria Silva's trembling hands. The worn wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of spectators who had come to witness her fate. At 68 years old, Maria's dark eyes, once bright with hope, now reflected only resignation as she stood before the judge in a simple blue dress, the nicest clothing she owned. "Maria Silva, this court finds you guilty on all charges," the judge announced, his voice cutting through the hushed room. "You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The elderly woman's shoulders slumped as if the very words had physical weight. Life without parole. The sentence echoed in her mind, each syllable hammering away at the fragile hope she desperately clung to throughout the trial. She would never again tend to her small garden of herbs and flowers, never again sit on her porch watching the sunset paint the Sao Paulo skyline in brilliant oranges and purples. As the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of reactions, Maria's knees buckled. A court officer moved quickly to steady her, his grip firm but not unkind. Across the aisle, she caught sight of a familiar face, a young mother from her neighborhood whose children Maria had often watched. The woman wept openly, mouthing words of support that couldn't bridge the gulf now stretching between them. "Your Honor, I must object." Her public defender's voice rose above the commotion, his threadbare suit and overstuffed briefcase betraying the overwhelming caseload he carried. "The evidence is circumstantial at best. My client has dedicated her life to helping children in need." But his protests faded into the background noise as Maria gazed around the courtroom one last time. She would never again feel the sun warming her small backyard or hear the neighborhood children laughing as they played in the street outside her modest home. The familiar sounds of her community, the fruit vendors' morning calls, the distant church bells, the stray dogs she secretly fed, all of it would be replaced by the cold echoes of prison corridors. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists, cold metal against her weathered skin. As they led her away, Maria thought of the 3 boys she had taken in all those years ago. Where were they now? Did they remember the woman who had once sheltered them from the storm? The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had saved so many children would now die in prison for another's sins, with no one to save her. Amid the chaos following the verdict, a commanding voice cut through the commotion. "Wait!" The single word reverberated through the Sao Paulo courthouse, causing a ripple of silence to spread from the back of the room. All eyes turned as 3 men strode purposefully down the center aisle. Their presence was magnetic, instantly silencing the murmurs and gasps that had filled the space moments before. The eldest walked slightly ahead, his tailored suit and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to being heard. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice steady and resolute, "we are her sons, and we have proof that will change everything." Maria Silva's breath caught in her throat. Through tear-blurred vision, she recognized the faces of the boys she'd once sheltered from a storm 25 years ago. Now they stood before her, grown, successful, determined men. Carlos Oliveira, with his surgeon's composure, Pedro Silva, whose analytical eyes missed nothing, and Rafael Santos, whose attorney's stance mirrored the judge's own authority. "This proceeding is concluded," the prosecutor snapped, rising to his feet. "The defendant has been sentenced. This is highly irregular." The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, studied the 3 men with undisguised curiosity. Her gavel remained poised, neither dismissing them nor inviting them forward. "Your Honor," Rafael stepped forward, his legal training evident in his measured tone. "We have evidence that was deliberately suppressed during these proceedings. evidence that proves our mother's innocence." Maria's public defender, who had been gathering his papers in defeat, froze. His head snapped up, eyes widening at this unexpected development. "And who exactly are you to make such claims?" the judge asked, her interest clearly piqued despite protocol. Carlos stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Carlos Oliveira, Chief Trauma Surgeon at Sao Paulo General. These are my brothers, Pedro Silva, CEO of Novatech Solutions, and Rafael Santos, Civil Rights Attorney. 25 years ago, Maria Silva saved our lives when no one else would. We will not stand by while she is condemned for crimes she did not commit." The prosecutor's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. The evidence was conclusive." "Was it?" Pedro asked quietly, holding up a small device. "Or was it manufactured?" The courtroom erupted again, but the judge's gavel silenced them. She studied Maria's face, then looked back at the three men standing resolutely before her bench. 10 minutes, she finally declared. "You have 10 minutes to present whatever evidence you claim to possess, not a second more." Maria's handcuffs felt suddenly lighter as hope, that dangerous and beautiful thing, flickered to life in her chest for the first time in years. Carlos Oliveira stood with quiet authority, his surgeon's hands steady as he opened a leather folder thick with documents. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes drawn to the three men who had burst in moments before. Their presence commanded attention, not just because of their interruption, but because of the unmistakable determination in their eyes. "Your Honor," Carlos began, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of preparation, "I am Dr. Carlos Oliveira, trauma surgeon at Sao Paulo Central Hospital, and these are my brothers." He gestured to the men flanking him, each radiating the same resolute energy. "Pedro Silva, founder and CEO of Nexus Software Solutions, and Rafael Santos, senior partner at Santos and Ferreira Civil Rights Law." The judge leaned forward, clearly intrigued by these successful professionals, claiming connection to the elderly defendant. "We are Maria Silva's sons," Carlos continued, his voice softening as he looked toward the frail woman at the defendant's table. "And our Mai is innocent of all charges." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she gazed at the three boys, now men, she had taken in during that stormy night, so many years ago. The memories washed over her like a tide. Three terrified children, huddled around her small kitchen table, their clothes still damp from the rain, their eyes wide with fear and hunger. She remembered how Carlos, even then the protector, had kept his arms around his younger brothers, how Pedro had flinched at every sudden movement, how Rafael had watched her with suspicion until she set steaming mugs of chocolate before them. "We have evidence," Pedro added, his tech entrepreneur confidence evident as he stepped forward, "that will prove beyond doubt that Eduardo Costa orchestrated this entire case against her." Rafael moved to stand directly between his mother and the prosecutor. The attorney's posture was protective, his legal training evident in every calculated word. "The prosecution has built their case on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. We have proof of both." Maria could hardly believe what was happening. The boys she had sheltered, fed, and loved, the children she had protected at great personal cost, now stood as powerful men, using their hard-won positions to shield her as she had once shielded them. "Your Honor," Carlos said, "we request 10 minutes to present evidence that will change the course of these proceedings." He placed a hand gently on Maria's shoulder. "This woman saved our lives when we had nothing. She gave us a home when we were homeless. She chose us as her sons when no one else would." The brothers stood united, their voices carrying the conviction of men who had overcome impossible odds, and the love of sons determined to save the mother who had once saved them. The judge's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his stern features. He leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You claim to possess evidence not seen at trial?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Rafael Santos stood tall, his voice carrying the weight of his legal training and the passion of a son fighting for his mother. Evidence suppressed, witnesses threatened. The real killer sits in this room. His words fell like stones in still water, ripples of shock spreading through the courtroom. Pedro Silva stepped forward, opening a sleek laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, and suddenly the courtroom screens illuminated with video footage. These security recordings were deliberately withheld, the software CEO explained, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. They show Maria nowhere near the crime scene at the time of the murder. Carlos Oliveira, still in his surgical scrubs, having rushed from the hospital, distributed folders to the judge and prosecutor. Financial records proving Eduardo Costa's network paid off key witnesses, the doctor explained, pointing to highlighted transactions, and medical reports showing inconsistencies in the autopsy findings. A collective gasp swept through the gallery as the brothers methodically dismantled the case against their mother. Rafael produced affidavits from 3 witnesses who had recanted their testimony, claiming they'd been threatened by Eduardo's associates. These people were coerced into silence, he explained, his voice breaking slightly. They've now come forward, at great personal risk, to tell the truth. From her seat at the defendant's table, Maria watched her sons work in perfect harmony. The surgeon's precision, the technologist's analytical mind, and the attorney's passionate advocacy. Behind her tears, a feeling she'd almost forgotten began to stir. Hope. A hope she'd buried decades prior when the prison doors had first closed behind her. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, objecting vehemently, but his protests sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence being presented. The judge raised his hand for silence, his gaze fixed on the documents before him. Your Honor, Rafael continued, we request an immediate stay of sentencing and a full review of this case. He moved closer to Maria, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. This woman saved us when no one else would. She taught us to stand for truth, no matter the cost. Today, we honor that lesson. Maria reached up to touch her son's hand, feeling the strength in his fingers. The family she had chosen, the boys she had sheltered from rain and violence so many years ago, now stood as men, fighting with everything they had to shelter her from injustice. In that moment, despite the uncertainty ahead, Maria felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt home. 25 years earlier, Maria Silva's life changed forever with a knock at her door at exactly 2:47 in the morning. The sound startled her awake, pulling her from a fitful sleep. Rain lashed against her windows as she cautiously approached the door, wrapping her threadbare robe tightly around her slender frame. When she peered through the peephole, her breath caught in her throat. 3 drenched boys, white and shivering, stood huddled together on her small porch. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14, his arm protectively wrapped around the shoulders of the youngest, who appeared to be crying silently. They were soaked to the bone, their clothes clinging to their thin bodies. Please, the oldest boy whispered when she cracked open the door. We need help. Something in his eyes, a haunted look she recognized all too well, made Maria open her door wider despite every instinct screaming caution. These were Carlos Oliveira, Pedro Silva, and Rafael Santos, though she wouldn't learn their full names until later. They had fled a nightmare she could scarcely imagine, running through the rain-soaked streets of Sao Paulo with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Against her better judgment, Maria welcomed them into her modest home. The boys stood dripping on her worn linoleum, looking both terrified and relieved. She found clean towels and dry clothes that had belonged to a neighbor's son, then set about making hot chocolate in her small kitchen. You're safe now, she told them, placing steaming mugs before each child. No one will hurt you here. Slowly, between sips of the sweet drink, fragments of their story emerged. Their parents had died years before, a car accident that left them in the care of their cousin, Eduardo Costa. What began as a reluctant guardianship had evolved into something monstrous. Eduardo had connections to a criminal network that exploited children, and the boys had overheard plans to force them into that dark world. Carlos, the eldest, described their desperate escape plan in a voice that cracked with emotion. Pedro, the middle child, stared silently into his mug, while Rafael, the youngest, occasionally added details his brothers omitted. As Maria listened, she recognized the pain in their eyes, the same fear and desperation she had known in her own childhood. Growing up in poverty with an abusive father had taught her what it meant to feel helpless, to yearn for safety that never came. "You can stay," she found herself saying, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "For as long as you need." Maria sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, as Carlos Oliveira recounted their ordeal. His voice trembled, but gained strength as he described the years of systematic abuse they'd endured at their cousin's hands. Eduardo Costa had taken guardianship after their parents' deaths, but instead of protection, he'd offered only cruelty and exploitation. "He started using us in his schemes when I was 11, Carlos explained, his eyes distant with painful memories. Pedro was just 8 then, and Rafael barely 6. The eldest brother described how Eduardo had forced them to steal, to lie, to serve as lookouts for his criminal operations. When they failed or resisted, the punishments were severe. Pedro Silva, the middle child, stared at his hands throughout the telling, occasionally nodding to confirm particularly difficult details. Rafael Santos, the youngest, leaned against Maria's side, seeking comfort in her warmth. "I started planning our escape 3 years ago," Carlos continued, "saving small amounts of money, memorizing bus routes, watching the guards' patterns." His voice carried a maturity far beyond his 15 years. "When Eduardo beat Rafael for refusing to deliver a package, we knew it was time." Maria listened, her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. These children had survived horrors she recognized all too well. The constant vigilance, the strategic thinking, the fierce protection of younger siblings. She saw her own childhood reflected in Carlos's tired eyes. "You walked for 2 nights?" she asked softly. Pedro nodded. Carlos carried Rafael when his feet got too sore. The middle brother spoke for the first time. "We had to hide during the day. Eduardo has people everywhere." Maria reached across the table, gently taking each boy's hand in turn. In their faces, wary, hopeful, exhausted, she recognized the same resilience that had carried her through her own darkest days. These children weren't broken. They were survivors, just as she had been. "Listen to me," Maria said, her voice firm with conviction. "You're safe here. While you're under my roof, no one will hurt you." She squeezed their hands, sealing the promise. "I don't have much, but what I have is yours now." The boys exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years, depending only on each other. Carlos, their protector, gave an almost imperceptible nod. None of them could have known in that moment how Maria's simple promise would bind their fates together. None could have foreseen the decades-long battle against evil that would follow, or how that kitchen table would become the foundation of a family, forged not by blood, but by choice and courage. Maria's newfound peace lasted only 4 days. On a humid Thursday afternoon, her front door burst open with such force that the hinges nearly gave way. Eduardo Costa stormed in, his expensive leather shoes tracking mud across her clean floor. 2 burly men flanked him, their expressions cold and threatening. "I've come for my cousins," Eduardo announced, his voice dripping with false concern. He produced a manila envelope and slapped it on Maria's kitchen table. "Legal guardianship papers, all perfectly in order." Maria scanned the documents, her heart racing. Even with her limited knowledge of legal terminology, she could tell they were forgeries. The signatures looked hastily scrawled, and several dates didn't align. The authorities will be very interested in how you've kidnapped 3 minors, Eduardo continued, adjusting his gold watch. A poor woman like you, taking children that don't belong to you? They'll lock you away for years. One of his men moved toward the hallway where the boys were hiding. Maria stepped in his path, her small frame somehow filling the doorway. They aren't going anywhere with you, she said firmly. Eduardo's false smile vanished. He pulled out another envelope, this one thick with cash. 100,000 reais, he said, placing it on the table. More money than you'll see in your lifetime. Take it and forget you ever met them. Maria stared at the envelope. The amount was staggering, enough to finish her education, repair her leaking roof, and live comfortably for years. She thought of her empty savings account and the mounting bills on her counter. She picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. The boys needed stability, protection, and love, things she could provide, but at what cost to herself? Eduardo was clearly dangerous, connected, and determined. The money represented security, a chance to escape the constant struggle of making ends meet. But accepting it meant abandoning 3 children to a monster. Maria remembered the terror in their eyes when they described their cousin's cruelty, the nightmares that woke them screaming. Eduardo watched her, confident in his power to buy what he wanted. Be sensible, he urged. You're one woman against me. I always get what I want. Maria's fingers tightened around the envelope as the impossible choice weighed on her. Secure her future by betraying 3 innocent boys, or defy a dangerous man and risk everything she had. Maria's hands trembled with righteous anger as she tore the envelope in half, sending 100 real notes fluttering to the floor like autumn leaves. The money, 100,000 reais, represented more than she'd earned in years of hard work. Yet the decision required no thought at all. "Get out of my house," she commanded, her voice low but unwavering. "These boys are staying with me." Eduardo Costa's transformation was immediate and chilling. The polished veneer of civility cracked, revealing the predator beneath. His eyes narrowed to slits, his mouth twisting into something barely human. "You stupid woman," he hissed, stepping closer until Maria could smell the expensive cologne masking something rotten underneath. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I can do to you?" Maria stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I know exactly what you are, a monster who preys on children." Eduardo's associates shifted uncomfortably by the door, but the man himself merely smiled, a cold reptilian expression that never reached his eyes. "This isn't over," he sneered, adjusting his tailored jacket. "Not by a long shot. You'll beg me to take them back before I'm done with you." He turned with calculated slowness, pausing at the threshold. "1 week, Maria. Then we do this my way." The door slammed behind them, rattling the modest frames on Maria's walls. She exhaled slowly, her legs suddenly weak as she sank into a kitchen chair, staring at the torn money scattered across her worn linoleum floor. A small sound from the hallway made her look up. Carlos stood there, his thin frame pressed against the wall, eyes wide with disbelief. How much had he witnessed? How much did this young boy understand about what had just transpired? "You," his voice cracked, "you turned down all that money? For us?" Maria crossed the room and knelt before him, taking his trembling hands in hers. Tears welled in the boy's eyes, and she realized he'd expected betrayal, had been conditioned to expect it from adults who should have protected him. "Listen to me, Carlos," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's not enough money in the world to make me hand you over to that monster. Not ever." The boy collapsed against her, silent sobs shaking his body as Maria held him close. Over his shoulder, she saw Pedro and Rafael peering from behind the bedroom door, their faces a mixture of fear and fragile hope. In that moment, something unbreakable formed between them, A bond forged in defiance of cruelty, in the simple choice to protect rather than profit. None of them could know how severely this bond would be tested in the years to come, how the darkness Eduardo represented would return again and again to threaten the family they were becoming. But for now, they had each other, and Maria silently vowed it would always be enough. The years passed, like pages in a well-worn book, each one telling a story of struggle and triumph. Maria Silva worked tirelessly, balancing multiple jobs while attending night classes. Her determination paid off when, at 48, she proudly received her college degree in education, tears streaming down her face as her 3 boys cheered from the audience. The small house in Sao Paulo that had once felt temporary now overflowed with achievements. Carlos Oliveira, the protective eldest, had secured a scholarship to medical school, his dream of becoming a trauma surgeon within reach. Pedro spent hours at the kitchen table, dismantling and rebuilding computers with an intuition that impressed even his professors. Rafael, the youngest, debated social justice issues with a passion that made Maria certain he would make an exceptional attorney someday. "We made it, Mai," Carlos said one evening, as they shared a modest celebration dinner. The kitchen table, once just a place of refuge during that stormy night years ago, had become the heart of their home, where dreams were shared and futures planned. For the first time in years, laughter echoed through the rooms. Maria would often pause in doorways, watching her sons with quiet pride, amazed at how the frightened boys had grown into confident young men. The weight of constant vigilance had finally begun to lift from her shoulders. Then came the phone call. Maria was preparing lunch when the landline rang. The voice on the other end sent ice through her veins. "Did you think I'd forget about my family obligations?" Eduardo Costa's words slithered through the receiver. "I've always known where you were." Her hand trembled as she gripped the phone. "Leave us alone. They're not yours anymore." His laugh was cold. "Return my cousins, or you'll regret it. I have friends in important places now. How do you think authorities would react to learning about your creative financial arrangements? The welfare money? The donations you solicited?" Maria's heart raced. She had always been scrupulously honest, but Eduardo was skilled at twisting truth into weapons. "I'll give you 1 week," he continued. "After that, I'll make sure everyone sees you as the fraud you are. Your sacrifices, your precious degree, all of it will mean nothing when you're exposed." The line went dead, leaving Maria clutching the receiver, her world suddenly unstable again. The peace they'd built felt like a castle of sand as the tide of Eduardo's threats rolled in. She placed the phone down slowly, wondering how she would tell her boys that the shadows of their past had finally caught up with them. Eduardo's leverage was as calculated as it was cruel. During a tense meeting in Maria's small living room, he revealed that he had systematically drained Rafael's inheritance, money left by their biological parents that should have funded his education and future. The revelation hit the family like a physical blow. "You see, Maria," Eduardo said with a cold smile, "I've been watching your little family for years. Everything you've built can disappear with one phone call." Maria Silva felt her world tilting as she realized the true extent of Eduardo's influence. His criminal network had infiltrated banks where they kept their modest savings, schools where her boys studied, and even the courts where she might seek protection. The man before her wasn't just a criminal. He was a spider at the center of a vast web. 300,000 reais, Eduardo continued, naming the sum he claimed Rafael was owed. "Return the boys to my guardianship, or I'll ensure you all face consequences far worse than poverty." That night, after Eduardo left, Carlos, Pedro, and Rafael gathered around the kitchen table, the heart of their home, and made a devastating decision. "We'll go with him," Carlos announced, his medical textbooks forgotten beside him. "It's the only way to protect you, Mai." Pedro nodded, eyes downcast. "I've researched his connections. He could destroy everything you've worked for." "We're not children anymore," Rafael added, his voice carrying the determination that would later serve him as an attorney. We can handle ourselves now. Maria looked at her sons, no longer the frightened boys who had appeared on her doorstep, but young men willing to sacrifice their freedom for her safety. The thought of them returning to Eduardo's control shattered her heart. No, she said firmly, tears streaming down her face. I won't let you sacrifice yourselves for me. We didn't come this far to surrender now. She reached across the table, taking their hands in hers. This family stays together. Whatever comes, we face it united. But even as they embraced, the clock on the wall ticked relentlessly forward. Eduardo had given them 48 hours to decide, and Maria knew his next move would be devastating. She had taught her boys to stand tall against injustice, but now she wondered if that lesson would cost them everything. Outside their window, a car engine idled. One of Eduardo's men, watching the house, a constant reminder that their time was running out. Rain pounded the abandoned port in Santos, turning the wooden planks of the pier slick and treacherous. Maria Silva stood with her shoulders squared, her wet clothes clinging to her frame as she faced Eduardo Costa across 20 feet of weathered dock. Behind the criminal stood 4 armed men, their faces obscured by the downpour, but their weapons clearly visible. You should have taken the money when you had the chance, Eduardo shouted over the storm, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. He yanked forward a small boy no older than 7, holding him by the collar. One more for your collection, Maria, or will you finally admit defeat? Carlos Oliveira stepped forward, his medical training evident in his calculated movements. Let the child go. This is between us. Pedro and Rafael flanked their brother, creating a protective barrier around their adoptive mother. Eduardo laughed, the sound hollow against the thunder. Always the hero, Carlos. But tonight, your little family drama ends. He gestured to one of his men, who tossed a folder onto the wet ground between them. Inside is everything needed to convict Maria of theft, fraud, and murder. The police are already building their case. Nobody will believe these lies, Rafael countered, his legal mind already calculating defenses. We have witnesses. Who will be dead by morning, Eduardo cut in. Just like your precious mother if you don't return what belongs to me. Maria stepped forward, rain streaming down her face. These boys never belong to you. They aren't property. The standoff intensified as Eduardo revealed his elaborate scheme, how he'd spent years manipulating evidence, bribing officials, and creating a paper trail that would lead directly to Maria. His network had grown beyond what any of them had imagined, tentacles reaching into banks, schools, and government offices. You have one choice, Eduardo snarled. The boys return with me now, or I destroy everything you've built. Pedro, his tech expertise having uncovered parts of Eduardo's network, whispered something to Rafael. The youngest brother nodded imperceptibly. Maria looked at her sons, men now, strong and principled, and saw in their eyes the lesson she'd taught them. Stand together, protect the vulnerable, never surrender to evil. Despite the guns pointed at them, despite the rain and wind threatening to sweep them into the churning waters below, they formed an unbreakable circle. We choose family, Maria declared, her voice steady as she reached for the terrified child. We always choose family. Eduardo's face contorted with rage as he realized the brothers had come prepared. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer by the second. The trap was set, but Eduardo still held all the cards, and his finger was tightening on the trigger. Thunder crashed above the abandoned port in Santos as chaos erupted on the rain-slicked pier. Eduardo Costa's men surged forward, weapons drawn. Maria Silva, without hesitation, threw herself between the armed thugs and the children. The gunshot echoed across the water, momentarily drowning out the storm. Maria! Carlos Oliveira screamed as she crumpled to the ground, crimson spreading across her blouse. The young medical student rushed to her side, his training overriding his panic. "Stay with me, mine," he whispered, applying pressure to the wound with trembling hands. Pedro Silva and Rafael Santos exchanged a silent look before launching themselves at Eduardo's men. The younger brothers fought with desperate fury, their movements coordinated from years of protecting each other on the streets. Pedro knocked a pistol from one thug's hand, sending it skittering across the wet concrete, while Rafael grappled with another, using the self-defense techniques Maria had insisted they learn. "You taught us to fight back," Rafael shouted toward Maria as he dodged a punch. "We won't let you down." Through the haze of pain, Maria watched her boys transform before her eyes, no longer the frightened children she'd taken in, but young men willing to risk everything for family. Carlos worked frantically, his medical knowledge their only hope. "The bullet missed her vital organs," he called out, ripping his shirt to create a makeshift bandage. "But she's losing too much blood." Eduardo backed away, his face contorted with rage. "This changes nothing. She'll still take the fall for everything." The wail of police sirens cut through the night, exactly as the brothers had planned. Their anonymous tip, carefully timed and detailed, had brought reinforcements exactly when needed. Officers swarmed the pier, weapons drawn. "Eduardo Costa," shouted the lead officer, "you're under arrest." As Eduardo was handcuffed, his expression shifted from shock to calculating malice. He leaned toward Maria, who was being lifted onto a stretcher. "This isn't over," he hissed. "My people will make sure you pay for this." The ambulance doors slammed shut with Maria inside, Carlos clutching her hand. Pedro and Rafael watched helplessly as the vehicle sped away, sirens blaring through the stormy night. Within hours, Eduardo's powerful connections began their work. News reports painted Maria as a criminal mastermind who had manipulated vulnerable boys for her own gain. Doctored evidence appeared, witnesses were pressured, and the truth became buried under an avalanche of lies. At the hospital, the brothers huddled around Maria's bed, their victory at the pier turning hollow as they realized the battle had only just begun. The woman who had saved them lay unconscious, fighting for her life, while outside her room, a different kind of storm gathered, one that would tear their family apart for decades to come. In the aftermath of the confrontation at the Santos port, Eduardo Costa's powerful network went to work. Judges were bribed, evidence tampered with, and witnesses threatened. The media, manipulated by Eduardo's allies, painted Maria Silva as a calculating criminal who had exploited 3 vulnerable boys for financial gain. Headlines screamed of fraud, embezzlement, and even murder. Crime that existed only in the fabricated narrative crafted by her enemies. The trial was a mockery of justice. Maria sat silently as prosecutors spun tales of her supposed greed. Her public defender, overwhelmed and underfunded, could barely mount a defense against the mountain of falsified evidence. When the gavel fell, Maria was sentenced to 30 years in a maximum security prison for crimes she had never committed. Carlos, Pedro, and Rafael watched from the shadows, their hearts breaking as their mother was led away in handcuffs. That night, they made a pact. They would disappear, build new lives and resources, and one day return to free her. With tears streaming down their faces, the brothers separated, each taking a new identity, crafted by Pedro's emerging technical skills. Carlos Oliveira moved to Rio de Janeiro, accelerating through medical school with singular focus. Pedro Silva relocated to Brasilia, where he built a software company from a single laptop in a rented room. Rafael Santos traveled furthest, to Porto Alegre, where he pursued law with the intensity of someone who had witnessed its perversion firsthand. Inside the cold walls of Penitenciária Feminina da Capital, Maria adapted to prison life with the same quiet dignity that had defined her existence. Fellow inmates, initially suspicious of the child exploiter, gradually recognized the gentleness in her eyes and the wisdom in her words. She became a mother figure to many, teaching literacy classes and offering comfort to younger women far from home. Every week, Maria wrote letters, 3 identical messages filled with love and encouragement. She had no addresses to send them to, no way of knowing if her boys were safe or even alive. The prison counselor, moved by her dedication, kept the growing stack in a special drawer. "One day," Maria would say, "they'll come for these. My sons will want to know I never stopped believing." Years slipped by like sand through fingers. Maria's hair grayed, lines deepened around her eyes, but her spirit remained unbroken. She marked birthdays, imagined graduations, and pictured the men her boys would become. In her dreams, they were safe, successful, and happy. The future she had sacrificed everything to give them. 15 years passed like a sentence of their own. Rafael Santos sat at his desk, legal briefs stacked neatly before him, when the letter arrived. Plain envelope, no return address, just his name in careful block letters. His hands trembled as he read the warning. Eduardo Costa would soon walk free. The civil rights attorney stared out his office window at Sao Paulo's skyline, memories flooding back. He hadn't spoken his mother's name aloud in years, the pain too raw. Yet she remained his moral compass. Rafael reached for his phone, hesitating before dialing the number he'd memorized but never used. "Pedro? It's me. We need to talk about Eduardo." 3 days later, the brothers reunited in a small coastal restaurant outside Santos. Carlos Oliveira arrived first, the trauma surgeon's face more lined than Rafael remembered. Pedro Silva came last, the software CEO's cautious eyes scanning for surveillance before sitting. 15 years of separation dissolved in tearful embraces. "I've tracked Eduardo's case," Rafael explained, spreading documents across the table. "His release is scheduled for next month, but there's more. He's been communicating with someone on the outside, someone powerful." Carlos leaned forward. "Maria, have you heard anything?" "Nothing new," Pedro answered, his voice tight. "The prison allows one letter every 6 months. Her last one mentioned dreams about us coming home." The middle brother opened his laptop, revealing financial records he'd hacked from Eduardo's hidden accounts. "Look at these transfers. He's been moving money to offshore accounts for years, building towards something big." Rafael's legal training helped him connect the dots. Eduardo plans to disappear, fake his own death, and pin it on Maria. With a murder charge, she'd never see freedom. "But why now, after all these years?" Carlos asked, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because the statute of limitations on his original crimes expires next year," Rafael explained. "He needs to eliminate anyone who could testify against him once he assumes his new identity." Pedro's fingers flew across the keyboard. "There's more. These transactions link to a shell company owned by someone named Sarah Costa. Any relation?" The brothers exchanged shocked glances as memories of Eduardo's lieutenant surfaced, a woman who'd stood in the shadows during their childhood nightmare. "We have 3 weeks," Carlos said, determination hardening his features. 3 weeks to unravel a conspiracy that's been brewing for 15 years. Rafael placed his hand in the center of the table. His brothers covered it with their own, a pact renewed. "For Maria," Pedro whispered. "For the truth," Carlos added. "For justice," Rafael finished, "and the family we almost lost." Outside, rain began to fall, washing away their footprints as the brothers departed separately, each carrying a piece of the puzzle that might finally free their mother. In a safe house on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, Carlos Oliveira, Pedro Silva, and Rafael Santos gathered around a makeshift command center. 3 decades had passed since they'd huddled at Maria's kitchen table as frightened boys, but the urgency in their eyes remained unchanged. Their mother's life hung in the balance, and time was running out. "These medical records don't make sense," Carlos muttered, spreading documents across the table. The trauma surgeon's trained eye caught discrepancies in Eduardo's hospital charts. "He's been faking treatments, creating alibis. Look at these blood work results. They're from different people." Pedro nodded, fingers flying across his keyboard. The software CEO had created a sophisticated algorithm to track financial movements. "I've found 7 offshore accounts receiving transfers from government contracts. The money trail leads back to someone working inside the justice system. Someone who's been pulling strings for years. The judge who sentenced Maria wasn't randomly assigned, Raphael added, legal documents spread before him. The civil rights attorney had spent weeks navigating bureaucratic labyrinths, calling in favors from colleagues. Eduardo's influence runs deeper than we imagined. As they pieced together the conspiracy, Pedro's computer chimed. "Someone's trying to access our network," he warned, typing frantically to reinforce their digital defenses. Seconds later, a message appeared on screen. "Kill Eduardo Costa within 48 hours or your mother dies. We're watching." The brothers exchanged glances, the weight of the ultimatum settling between them. "This isn't Eduardo's style," Raphael observed. "Someone else is orchestrating this. Someone who wants both Eduardo and Maria eliminated." Carlos paced the room, his medical training at odds with the violence being demanded. "We didn't survive what we did to become killers ourselves," he said firmly. "Maria taught us better than that." Pedro uncovered a pattern of identity theft stretching back 15 years. Eduardo's been impersonating officials, bribing witnesses, but look at the timing of these events. They're too perfect, too coordinated. Someone's been guiding him. Raphael studied security footage he'd obtained from the courthouse. There, he pointed to a woman in the background of multiple hearings. She's been at every proceeding against Maria, always watching, never participating. The brothers froze as facial recognition software identified her. Sarah Costa, Eduardo's former lieutenant, thought to have died years ago. "She's the shadow behind everything," Pedro whispered. "Eduardo's just been her puppet. A moral crucible lay before them: commit murder or risk their mother's execution. But Maria's sons remembered her most important lesson. There was always another way, if you were brave enough to find it." "We don't kill Eduardo," Carlos decided, determination hardening his features. "We find Sarah and end this, our way." The brothers stood at the edge of a moral precipice. Carlos Oliveira paced the small room they'd rented, his surgeon's hands trembling slightly. "We can't become killers. That's what Eduardo wants, to make us like him." Pedro Silva nodded, his tech entrepreneur's mind already racing toward alternatives. "There's always another solution," he said, fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "I've traced unusual power surges to a records facility downtown. That's where the mastermind must be operating from." Rafael Santos studied the building schematics Pedro had hacked. "And I believe that's where they're holding Maria," the attorney said, voice tight with urgency. "But we need to be careful. My sources indicate the place is rigged with explosives." The three men, once frightened boys huddled at their adoptive mother's kitchen table, now formulated a plan to save her life. Using Pedro's tech expertise, they bypassed the facility's security systems. Carlos prepared medical supplies, fearing what condition they might find their mother in after her imprisonment. Raphael coordinated with trusted contacts in law enforcement to stand ready, but at a distance, knowing any official intervention might trigger disaster. Under cover of darkness, they infiltrated the records facility in the heart of São Paulo. The building stood silent, its corridors dimly lit. Following Pedro's digital breadcrumbs, they discovered a hidden elevator shaft leading to a subterranean level, not on any official blueprint. "She's down there," Pedro whispered, pointing to heat signatures on his device. The underground chamber revealed a nightmare scenario. Maria Silva sat bound to a chair, surrounded by explosives with digital timers. But it wasn't Eduardo who turned to face them. It was Sarah Costa, his former lieutenant. "I've been waiting for you, boys," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Eduardo was just a puppet. I've been pulling the strings for 25 years." The revelation struck like lightning. Sarah's vendetta wasn't random. It was deeply personal. As she circled Maria's chair, she revealed the truth. Her own brother had died on the streets after being denied help. The same night, Maria had taken in 3 homeless boys instead. "You chose them," Sarah hissed at Maria. "While my brother froze to death, I've spent every day since making sure you paid for that choice." Carlos stepped forward, medical instincts assessing his mother's condition even as he addressed Sarah. "Your brother's death was a tragedy, but punishing Maria won't bring him back." "This was never about bringing him back," Sarah replied, revealing the detonator in her hand. "It was about making sure no one forgets what happens when the wrong children are saved." The records facility echoed with tension as Maria Silva faced Sarah Costa across the dimly lit room. Explosives lined the walls, a testament to Sarah's determination to end this decades-long vendetta. Carlos, Pedro, and Rafael stood frozen, calculating their options as their mother stepped forward. "I know what drives you," Maria said softly, her weathered hands steady despite the danger. "The same pain that's haunted me for 25 years. Sarah's finger hovered over the detonator. "You know nothing about my pain. I know what it's like to lose someone you love," Maria continued, her voice carrying the weight of her 68 years. "To feel that hollow space where they should be." The brothers exchanged glances, recognizing their mother's strategy. Carlos Oliveira stepped forward instinctively to protect her, but Maria raised her hand, stopping him. "Your brother's death wasn't your fault," Maria said, watching recognition flicker across Sarah's face. "Eduardo used that pain to twist you into something you never wanted to become." Sarah's composure cracked. "He promised justice and delivered only more suffering," Maria replied. "I've spent decades in prison, separated from my boys. Haven't we all lost enough?" Pedro tensed, ready to lunge for the device if necessary, while Rafael analyzed Sarah's body language, looking for signs of surrender or escalation. "It's never too late to choose love over vengeance," Maria pleaded, her voice steady even as death loomed around them. "I made that choice when 3 frightened boys appeared at my door. You can make it now." Sarah's eyes darted between the brothers, the surgeon, the tech executive, the attorney. Men who had risen from abandoned children to become forces of good. Her hand trembled on the detonator. "What happens to me if I stop this?" she whispered. Rafael stepped forward. "Justice, but also mercy. I'll represent you myself." A tear slid down Sarah's cheek as memories of her own childhood surfaced, of the brother she'd failed to protect, of Eduardo's manipulation, of years spent pursuing vengeance that had hollowed her from within. 9471, she finally said, lowering the device. The disarm code. Pedro immediately moved to the control panel, fingers flying across the keypad. The red lights on the explosives faded to green, then off completely. As authorities flooded the facility, Sarah surrendered herself to Rafael's custody. The criminal network that had terrorized their family for 25 years began collapsing that very hour, as Sarah provided names, locations, and evidence. Maria watched, exhausted but triumphant, as her sons secured the scene. In that moment of crisis, compassion had accomplished what decades of vengeance could not, bringing peace to both victim and perpetrator alike. The courtroom erupted in thunderous applause as the judge dismissed all charges against Maria Silva. After 25 years of injustice, the truth had finally prevailed. Carlos Oliveira, Pedro Silva, and Rafael Santos rushed to embrace their mother, their faces streaked with tears of joy and relief. "It's over, Carlos whispered, his surgeon's hands trembling as he held the woman who had sacrificed everything for them. "You're free now." Maria could barely stand, overwhelmed by the moment. The prison jumpsuit hung loosely on her 68-year-old frame, a stark reminder of the years stolen from her. Yet, her eyes shone with the same fierce love that had given 3 desperate boys shelter on that stormy night decades ago. Outside the Sao Paulo courthouse, reporters swarmed as Rafael addressed the media. The civil rights attorney spoke with measured confidence, detailing the evidence that had exonerated his mother while carefully avoiding compromising ongoing investigations into Eduardo's criminal network. Justice delayed is still justice, he stated firmly. Today marks not just my mother's freedom, but a turning point in how we protect the vulnerable in our society. Pedro stood quietly beside his brothers, the software CEO's analytical mind already planning their mother's transition home. He'd secretly renovated her small house, ensuring it would welcome her with familiar comforts while accommodating her new needs. Perhaps most surprising was Sarah Costa's presence at the courthouse. The former criminal lieutenant had provided crucial testimony, her face solemn as she watched Maria walk free. When their eyes met across the crowded steps, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Two women whose lives had been defined by impossible choices. The authorities, impressed by Sarah's cooperation and genuine remorse, offered her a reduced sentence with community service. She would use her intimate knowledge of criminal operations to help identify and rescue children trapped in similar situations. "I want to help break the cycle," Sarah told Maria quietly, as they stood in the dappled sunlight outside the courthouse. "You showed me it's possible to choose a different path." Maria simply nodded, too overwhelmed for words. She stepped outside the prison gates into the morning light, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face without barriers for the first time in decades. Her sons flanked her protectively as they walked toward the waiting vehicle. "Where to now, Mai?" Pedro asked gently. Maria Silva looked at her three sons, once homeless boys, now powerful men who had moved mountains to save her, and smiled through her tears. "Home," she said simply. "Let's go home." 6 months after her release, Maria Silva's modest Sao Paulo home buzzed with life and laughter. The living space that once felt cramped for four now somehow accommodated everyone who gathered around her famous kitchen table. The old wooden table, scratched and worn from decades of use, had been extended with mismatched leaves, a perfect metaphor for the family itself, different pieces coming together to create something whole. "More coffee, Sarah?" Maria asked, her weathered hands steady as she poured from a steaming pot. Sarah Costa nodded gratefully, a shy smile replacing the hardened expression she'd worn for decades. The former lieutenant had found unexpected peace in Maria's forgiveness, working alongside the family to rebuild what her vengeance had nearly destroyed. Carlos Oliveira visited whenever his surgical schedule allowed, often bringing medical supplies for their community outreach program. Today, he sat beside Pedro, who was showing a teenager how to code on a laptop. The software CEO had developed a free technology training course that was already helping dozens of vulnerable youth secure stable employment. "We've got 3 more families joining next week," Rafael announced, looking up from his paperwork. The attorney had transformed his practice, dedicating half his time to providing legal aid to families at risk of separation. His eyes met his mother's across the room, both remembering how close they'd come to losing each other forever. The home had become the headquarters for second chances, the program Maria had dreamed of during her years behind bars. What began as informal counseling sessions had grown into a registered nonprofit, offering shelter, education, and healing to children and families touched by violence and poverty. "Jordan's artwork got accepted to the youth exhibition," Maria announced proudly, pinning a colorful drawing to the already crowded refrigerator. The 12-year-old boy, their newest resident, beamed with pride, his trauma-induced silence gradually giving way to creative expression. In the backyard, where Maria had once feared she'd never feel the sun again, a vegetable garden flourished. The neighbors who had once whispered about the criminal now stopped by for fresh tomatoes and life advice from the woman whose resilience had become legendary throughout the community. As evening fell, Maria watched her expanded family from the porch steps. The wounds inflicted by Eduardo and his network hadn't disappeared. Carlos still woke from nightmares. Pedro struggled with trust, and Rafael carried the weight of justice denied for so many years. But healing had begun, not just for her sons, but for everyone who found their way to her door. "Room for one more?" Maria asked softly, as she always did when someone new arrived, knowing her table and her heart would always expand to welcome another soul in need of home. A year after her freedom, Maria Silva received an unexpected call from the governor of São Paulo. Her hands trembled as she listened to the news. She had been chosen for Brazil's highest humanitarian honor. The woman who had once faced a life sentence was now being celebrated for her courage and compassion. On the day of the ceremony, Maria stood before a crowd of hundreds, her 3 sons beaming with pride in the front row. Carlos Oliveira, Pedro Silva, and Rafael Santos, the trauma surgeon, software entrepreneur, and civil rights attorney, watched as their mother accepted the medal with dignified grace. "This honor belongs not to me alone," Maria said, her voice steady despite her emotion, "but to every child who has ever needed a home, and to every person brave enough to provide one." As she spoke, her thoughts drifted back to that stormy night 26 years ago when 3 frightened boys knocked on her door. The memory remained vivid, their shivering bodies, the fear in their eyes, and the simple cup of hot chocolate that began their journey together. How strange that by saving them, she had ultimately saved herself. In the months following her release, Maria had transformed her modest home into a sanctuary. The kitchen table. After the ceremony, the family gathered in Maria's backyard, now filled with laughter and conversation. Carlos embraced his mother, whispering how proud he was. Pedro documented everything with his smartphone, while Rafael discussed expanding their program with local officials. As twilight settled over São Paulo, Maria watched her family, biological and chosen, sharing stories around the table. The trauma surgeon who had once been a frightened child now saved lives daily. The tech entrepreneur who had hidden in her closet from monsters now created tools to protect others. The attorney who had cried himself to sleep now fought tirelessly for justice. Their story, one of sacrifice, impossible choices, and the power of chosen family, remained a testament to the courage it takes to love without limits. As Maria looked around at the lives intertwined with hers, she understood that real family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about the people who stand beside you when the world turns its back. The elderly woman smiled, knowing that the greatest victory wasn't the medal or even her freedom. It was the family they had built together, stronger than any force that had tried to tear them apart.